Hey everyone, if you'd like to see the unedited version of this video, commercial-free, please consider signing up for my Patreon page. It really helps me out so I can keep making History of Rock content, and I get to go a little more in depth without having to cater to YouTube's broken copyright system and buggy editing software. Also, a huge thank you to everyone who supported the original YouTube video and shared their own feelings and stories about this landmark album. Sorry I had to re-upload this, but please feel free to comment below. Enjoy the video. Dark Side of the Moon. Where do I even start? This may very well be the greatest album ever made. It's certainly one of my favorites. Every single album I've ever produced has basically been me attempting to match its creative genius and flow of music. Of course, we discussed it in History of Rock the 1970s, but my dad, Jay Curtis, still acting in character, really gave a first-person recollection of what it was like to hear the album at the time of its release.
Dark Side of the Moon. What an album. I bought the album when it was new, the record, and I put it on the turntable. I think I listened to it for like 3 days straight, and it is one of the greatest albums ever made.
And this is, in fact, that very same record. I mean, the sleeve is coming apart, it's got so many scratches, but when I put this baby on the turntable, I forget all about that. I mentioned before that I really came to appreciate this album after watching a documentary from Classic Albums, which I highly recommend. And it was from this documentary that I really got into production. To even begin to explain this album's influence on pop culture is no short order. Hipgnosis' iconic cover has been seen by even non-music fans.
Prism design comes from three basic ingredients, one of which is the light show, the themes of the lyrics, ambition and greed, and thirdly was an answer to Richard Wright, who said that he wanted something
simple and bold and dramatic.
Dark Side of the Moon is one of the best-selling albums of all time. It was on the charts for 14 years without ever coming off, and even then has continued to return to the Billboard charts off and on for the past few decades. Of course, it's also become a cult legend that if you play this album while watching The Wizard of Oz, they sync up perfectly. Supposedly, you start the record after the MGM Lion's third roar. Hell, even the angry video game nerd had some fun with this on his review of the Super Nintendo game. But what is it about Dark Side of the Moon that continues to inspire generation after generation so long after its release, myself included? Well, let's dive into its history. As I mentioned before, Pink Floyd was experiencing a time of great creativity, having struck gold with the track Echoes off the album Meddle, although their sales in the US were still pretty underwhelming. They had a couple of leftover tracks which would eventually make up parts of Breathe, Us and Them, and Roger Waters' Brain Damage, written during the Meddle sessions. At the end of 1971, they had a band meeting at Nick Mason's house. Roger pitched a concept about a singular theme: madness. More specifically, the aspects of life that drive someone to madness.
Whether they push you towards insanity, death, empathy, greed.
Everyone seemed interested in this idea, and Roger started coming up with some demos and would compose all the lyrics to this album. But the band was still very much a creative entity, so a lot of ideas flourished from jam sessions. Before long, they had a piece ready which they called Eclipse, a piece for Assorted Lunatics. And man, did they perform this piece a lot in their 1972 shows, which really gave them the time and practice to flesh out ideas until it was just right. It's actually pretty fascinating to listen to all these bootlegs from that tour and see how these pieces evolve over time.
The performances were pretty tight and not so hard to get.
So in May of 1972, now having a mostly complete concept ready, Pink Floyd went into the studio to start recording, this time with Alan Parsons behind the console, who was responsible for a clear-sounding performance and quite a few experimental ideas involving tape loops. And it's the tape loops, conceived mostly by Nick Mason, that create a sort of overture for this piece. Speak to Me starts off with a heartbeat, which was actually recorded with an affected kick drum. We hear sounds of clocks, cash registers, laughter, screams, and several voices that will sort of emphasize the themes throughout this album. The first time I spun this record, sometime in the late 90s or early 2000s, I didn't know what to think. What was I listening to? I never heard anything like this. And the tension just rises until we crash into the opening chord of Breathe. But it doesn't start rocking out like you think it would. No, the slow pulse continues with Dave's affected guitar, Rick's melodic Rhodes, Nick just kind of riding on the drums, and Roger giving the groove some punches with his thick bass. The bridge features a unique chord sequence by Rick, taking his influence from Miles Davis's All Blues.
That chord I just loved.
And then David's multi-tracked voice comes in, providing that meditative vibe. The dynamics are perfectly placed. 1 minute you're breathing in the air, not afraid to care. The next minute you gotta dig that hole and forget the sun. And dynamics are a key element to this record. It's perfectly paced. I mean, you're not gonna hear any fast-grooving Black Sabbath songs here, but the journey through the soft jazz chords to the biting blues guitar melodies and these tense soundscapes are just so intricately placed for a perfect listening experience. It's why this album has to be listened to the whole way through, and part of the reason why I put up that video why a Pink Floyd playlist doesn't work. Speaking of soundscapes, Breathe transitions into On the Run, a more digital sounding track created from a Synthi AKS sequencer. This was recorded much later in the sessions, and if you listen to early live recordings, you can hear the travel sequence, as it was called, being done more as a guitar jam piece featuring David's delay pedal. I do like this rendition, but I can see why they went with the sequencer idea. It was a very new sound at the time, and it really does create this sense of paranoia, originated by a fear of flying. Probably doesn't help that we get the sound of a plane crashing and footsteps running before the sound of chiming clocks takes over. This leads us into Time, credited to all band members, and honestly, this is the point of no return for me. I'm listening to the album, I gotta finish it. It's a masterpiece, from the opening metronome played on Roger's muted bass, to Nick's rototoms, to David's ethereal guitar solo, really one of his best. It's such a testament to his musicianship that Dave can evoke so much emotion and intensity with so few notes. They all mean something, which services the song rather than just being a time to show off. And if that weren't enough, I love the juxtaposition of Dave's rockin' vocal in the verses to Rick's soft singing in the choruses. And it's all held together by Roger's genius lyrics about the fear of mortality and running out of time. Maybe his best line ever written, and sung beautifully by Rick, is "Hanging on in quiet desperation is the English way." Man, if that isn't a universally understood feeling, especially in these times, I don't know what is. The song then reprises to Breathe, refocusing the lyrical motifs before we come to the haunting Great Gig in the Sky, led by Rick Wright's piano and dressed up with David's pedal steel. This is another one that went through a few different variations live, referred to as the Mortality sequence with sampled biblical passages. It actually sounds more like Saucerful of Secrets in this early rendition. And the harmonic structure of this piece, never quite staying in the same key, is a testament to Rick's genius. But they weren't quite sure what to place over this instrumental. They tried sampling NASA recordings, but they were still trying to shake off that space rock label. Just as they were finishing the sessions, Alan Parsons suggested session singer Clare Torry.
They played me the backing track, and I said, well, what do you want? And basically, they had no idea.
Clare really just improvised this melody on the spot, and it's breathtaking. It's so emotionally haunting and yet so seductive at the same time.
I thought, I have to pretend to be an instrument, and that's gave me an avenue to explore.
And we, in fact, were sitting in the studio saying, this is wonderful.
There were at least a couple times Clare performed the song live with Pink Floyd, including the Delicate Sound of Thunder tour. Years later, Clare sued to get her name on the credits, considering she had in fact come up with the melody, and later pressings include her as a writer with Rick. Great Gig in the Sky ends side 1 on such a dramatic note, and as side 2 comes up, perfectly in sync with the moment where the Wizard of Oz changes to color, we kick off with a tape loop of coins, cash registers, paper ripping, making up the 7/4 metronome for the best-known song from the album, and in fact their first hit single in America, Money. First of all, it's such an infectious bass line. The song was written solely by Roger. You can actually hear his full demo of the song. But Dave's rock and roll voice and guitar really bring it to life. It's nice that this song is more tongue-in-cheek in comparison to the rest of the album, satirizing the lifestyle of the rich and famous. That's Cambridge friend Dick Perry playing saxophone, his first contribution to their catalog. The song really gets rockin' when we transition into 4/4 time, and Dave rips some of the best blues licks he ever came up with, juxtaposed with Nick's iconic drum fills. I can't begin to say how much time I spent as a teenager trying to learn every single one of these licks. But maybe one of the more interesting lyrical aspects of the song that I picked up on recently is how the vibe subtly changes in the third verse from being satire to more sinister, with money being the root of all evil. The transition begins with several voices saying they were in the right in relation to a question they were asked about the last time they were violent. And the violent sequence begins with Rick's mournful organ, Us and Them. God, does this song bring me to my knees. As you may recall from an earlier video, this was the song rejected for the violent sequence in Zabriskie Point, built around Rick's brilliant chord sequence, all pedaling on a D bass note. Roger's lyrics are very sparse, emphasized by a delay. Because there's room to really take in what's being said. We contemplate on lyrics questioning the futile yet very primal acts of violence against fellow human beings. The choruses embody the acts of violence and death, with Dave and Rick's voices crying out in anger. The third chorus reflects back to the theme of greed and how one rich person's indifference to those less fortunate can lead to death. We get a beautiful interplay between Rick's piano solo and Dick's sax solo, juxtaposed by a telling story recounted by a roadie named Roger the Hat. It's such a unique way of emphasizing the theme by having a real person recount his own honest feelings about violence. Now, if you were to ask me what one of my favorite moments in music history ever was, it would be the transition from Us and Them into Any Color You Like. This is the reason I cannot listen to these songs on their own. It's a credit to them working this out live that the transition between the echoing die die to the rich texture of Rick's Moog synthesizer melody is so seamless. Rick's Moog is affected by the same delay heard on the voices in Us and Them, and David's guitar is given a univibe treatment, all while Roger and Nick provide a funky backbeat. We're into the home stretch of Dark Side as we open up in the key of D major and Roger takes the lead vocal for Brain Damage, really the song that kicked off the concept of Dark Side of the Moon. Roger has admitted that the song is at least partially about Syd Barrett, with lyrics like, if the band you're in starts playing different tunes, it seems to question if Syd was really the crazy one or everyone else around him was. But the main theme of the song, the whole record really, lies in what would become the title of the album. If you feel these feelings of madness and anxiety, you can at least take comfort that you are not the only one. So, I'll see you on the dark side of the moon. as I guess you'll see everybody who feels these feelings. And the way they use a gospel-like choir really makes this song so uplifting. Rick's synths and organ transitions to the last song, Eclipse, which Roger sings with such an understanding of human empathy. And then he's joined by Rick, Dave, and all the backup singers, notably Doris Troy, whose vocal licks amplify the intensity of the song. You know, in really reanalyzing these lyrics, which obviously everybody has their own interpretation as to what they mean, I realized where yin and yang from my Elements piece really came from.
There is a daily dissolve between dark and light.
Because Eclipse really is yin and yang, the light and the darkness. All of life is about the delicate balance between these two. The fact that it begins with lyrics first heard in Breathe, All You Touch and All You See, emphasizes that. At the end of my father's life, I confessed to him that I felt my entire life was shrouded in darkness, but then he told me there is always light. And that's the message of this album. Even if you've realized it too late, everything you've ever done in your life, or will ever do in your life, matters. Everything under the sun is in tune, but the sun is eclipsed by the moon. And I think Roger clarified it best at the end of the Classic Albums documentary.
But that's not to say that the potential for the sun to shine doesn't exist. You know, walk down the path towards the light rather than walk into the darkness.
You know, for a band that so many people call depressing, this is, in a cosmic sort of way, one of the most uplifting endings to any album I've ever heard. And the way the heartbeat comes back in with Jerry O'Donnell's final declaration, "There is no dark side of the moon, really. As a matter of fact, it's all dark," emphasizes the theme of empathy. This is a masterpiece, conceptually, lyrically, musically, and sonically. But there's one more aspect that needs to be addressed. Because if this album had not been promoted properly, we wouldn't be here talking about it, or probably any Pink Floyd records for that matter. To their credit, Capitol Records got their act together and promoted the hell out of this album.
They brought in a man called Bhaskar Menon, who decided that he was going to make the American company sell this record.
And boy, did it pay off. I'm so relieved that an album like this became so popular. In a sea of trivial, formulaic, meaningless music, the fact that this work of art is still spun to this day, I think it gives some hope for our culture. You know, I had a really stressful weekend, very busy work-wise, and not to mention all the horrible things that are going on in the world right now. And on the way to my gig on Sunday, I just decided to, obviously in preparation for this video, spin Dark Side of the Moon again. I listened to it all the way on the drive to my venue, and even when I got there, I sat there and made sure the album finished. And my God, I was just reminded that no matter what state of mind I'm in, no matter how down I am, this is an album that will always give me peace of mind. I think it gives a lot of people peace of mind. Every time I play this album for someone who's never really heard it, they're amazed by what they just heard. I decided to reach out to Nick Petrella, my History of Rock co-host, and generally we would do some sort of silly sketch in one of these videos, but I really just wanted to ask him his earnest, honest thoughts about Dark Side of the Moon. So I'm just going to let you take it from here, Nick.
So I'm going to be honest, up until JT asked if I wanted to be a part of this particular album review, I had never actually listened to Dark Side of the Moon in full. I mean, I know about Money since that got heavy radio airplay, but that was pretty much it. And now that I have listened to it, I have only one word to describe it. And that word is transcendent. Ended.
Every song on the album, starting with Speak to Me and going into Breathe, then going into On the Run, then going into Time, then going into Great Gig in the Sky, and so on and so forth, just seems to flow into each other smoothly like a river. It's a mesmerizing experience, to say the least, and I can only imagine what listening to this album was like when it was brand new. It's really hard to choose a standout track since all of them are really good, but if I had to choose one, I would say it would definitely be Time. What really gets me about it is David Gilmour's vocals and his guitar work, and just how everything just sort of blends together like some sort of great psychedelic rock stew. It also deals with a great subject that every person living and every person who ever will live will have to deal with no matter what: the passage of time.
Whether you have the actual record, the CD, or even if you're just streaming it on Spotify, it's an album you have to listen to at least once in your life. Hell, you don't even need drugs to fully enjoy it. But it helps.
Thanks, Nick. And even when I was writing this copy, it brought real, actual tears to my eyes. It reminds me so much of my father, how much love he had for this album, and how that love was passed down a generation and got me through so much heartache in my life. I owe so much to Pink Floyd for making this album. It's why I wanted to do this review series to begin with. It doesn't matter if they have a couple albums in their catalog that aren't as good. If this was the only thing they ever made in their entire career, Pink Floyd would still be one of my favorite bands of all time. So I'm saying right here to David, Roger, Nick, and posthumously Rick, thank you for making this album. Dark Side of the Moon gets a goldfish, and that's an understatement. If you have a turntable, you need to own this album on vinyl. God, I really don't want to give an essential track for this album, but I'm going to go ahead and agree with Nick and choose Time, as it's a collaboration between all band members showing off their individual strengths. But seriously, you need to listen to the whole album in one sitting, and put your phone away when you do. Just give yourself 45 minutes to appreciate an amazing work of art without distractions. Wow. That was an experience writing a review for this album. We really have reached Pink Floyd's creative peak. I mean, they can't possibly top this masterpiece. Or can they? There is no dark side in the moon, really. As a matter of fact, it's all dark.